Hey everybody, TacticAngel back on the PlayStation 5 to take a look at another premium ship in World of Warships Legends. This time we'll be taking a look at the Collingwood, a Tier 6 premium Royal Navy battleship. For this review, I'll start with some history, move into analysis, discuss commanders, run down the stats with you, and then we'll finish off with some gameplay. If you do want to skip around at all, you should see some time codes in the description. The Collingwood isn't really a design of any ship the Royal Navy considered building. The design of the ship is vaguely reminiscent of the F2 and F3 Battlecruiser designs pictured here, but these ships were intended to be Battlecruiser counterparts to the 03 design battleship, which would go on to be HMS Nelson and Rodney. The F2 and F3 Battlecruisers were armed with 15-inch guns though, and they were intended to fit within the Washington Naval Treaty. Nelson and Rodney were both built under the understanding that every other major naval power had at least a few 16-inch battleships floating around out there, so it was only fair to let the British build two. The F2 Battlecruiser in particular was designed to carry 6 15-inch 50 caliber guns in 3 turrets. These would have been an upgrade to the 15-inch 42 caliber guns that we see on other ships, like Hood. The advantage here being that it was expected to be able to attain speeds of at least 30 knots, though you can find some suggestions that the speed might have actually been slightly higher than that. That's not blazingly fast by World War II standards, but it would have put the F2 design in a competitive speed category with Hood, then the fastest capital ship in the world, and on a hull that was just 35,000 tons, which is a little bit over 11,000 less than the Admiral-class battlecruiser. F3 would shed just a bit of speed in favor of a 3x3 arrangement of 15-inch guns. One area where these designs differed according to some sources from Nelson and Rodney is that the third turret, or C turret, superfired over the middle turret, or B turret, rather than the middle turret being the superfiring one that we see on Nelson and Collingwood. The reason why this design doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense is how you'd end up with a ship toting 6 16.5-inch guns. That would break the treaty and exceed the exception made for Nelson and Rodney. If you're going to break the treaty, then why not go whole hog and build something like the K or N class series with 18-inch guns? That would have made more sense since at least 18-inch guns exist in Britain, and this 16.5-inch, which we have on several ships including Conqueror, were contemplated but never even made it to the prototype phase. And by the time that the British abandoned the Washington Naval Treaty, you see them return to more traditional layouts with an AB XY turret arrangement. In any case, we won't talk about this for long because this just happens to kind of look like Nelson and a little bit like the F2 and F3 designs. As we look at Collingwood in game, we'll just say a few things right off the bat. For one, Collingwood might be one of my favorite Canadian whiskeys, and the ship color scheme is gray, 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 and gray, so I may be a little bit biased. On the other hand, this ship is going to play very much the Nelsonian version of would you rather play Georgia or Missouri. I might be biased in completely the opposite direction there, but we'll try to get you a good feeling for how this ship plays one way or the other. As far as what the Collingwood is good at, it's more or less all down to the guns, and her consumables which support those guns. Collingwood comes in with a 16.5-inch main battery, and though it doesn't get too many of those, just 6, they do overmatch most bow armor that you can face, and they tend to do a lot of damage if they actually hit something well. The game will tell you that these reload fairly quickly. That's kind of true, though again, it's not that important since you don't have all that many of them. What is important is that you get the holy grail of battleship consumables, and another one that's just kind of nice to have. This comes in the form of a main battery reload booster for punishing people who didn't even necessarily make a mistake. Then you also have sonar, which can be nice just to keep your ship above the waves and avoiding torpedoes. Unfortunately, one of the things that Collingwood is good at is overpenning most things that it can hit, and as a result, it's pretty good at frustrating you with those 1300 point hits. With just 6 guns though, unless you do something about your accuracy, you may consider the few overpens you get relatively lucky. 2 or 3 misses can make a big difference in this ship. The other downside is generally the Collingwood is pretty susceptible to damage. It may have better protection against 152mm guns, but it takes more damage from quite literally anything larger than that, and her heals are nothing really special. Ultimately, folks who will enjoy the Collingwood are the same sort of folks who are able to get ships like the Georgia or perhaps the Champagne to work Without referencing another premium ship though, those people who have figured out how to more or less get the Gneisenau to behave without relying on torpedoes or secondaries should also enjoy this. For folks who like typical Royal Navy battleships that tank tons of damage and just heal it all back, this isn't your ship. And if you like to sit on HE and quietly hum Rule Britannia, you'll similarly find pretty poor results. Next we'll go to commanders. My go-to in British ships is generally Madden, largely because he grants so much potential survivability. This doesn't quite work well on the Collingwood versus the Nelson, and we'll get into exactly why that works in the stats section of this review, but he will still make you the most survivable version of this ship. The normal issue he has, which is that, other than his base trait, he's not going to do much for your offense, in particular your shell grouping, and this is going to be even more noticeable in a ship with only 6 guns. Hitting with 4 or 5 HE shells in Nelson not only is more satisfying than hitting with 2 or 3 poorly placed AP shells, it's also a lot more effective, which is one reason you may want to stay away from this. And therefore, the sensible option is probably to take Cunningham, who has both a helpful base trait and several skills that you will need in order to reliably hit things and hit things where you're aiming. He can also grant additional AP damage if you're really into that, though Collingwood is already slow enough that maybe you don't want to trade away a lot of speed just for more damage. Downside here is that you're now playing a game that is completely different than the rope-a-dope strategy of Nelson, and your long-term survivability is going to depend a lot on taking out targets quickly and efficiently, rather than simply outliving them. While Jellicoe is far from an attractive option for most, there's something to be said about having a 3rd reload booster and 3rd sonar. Since you'll end up with a 4th heal along the way, this would offset not having wool to rebuild somewhat, and Jellicoe's base trait does provide you with additional HP recovery. Like any other base commander, he offers you more eclectic benefits from improved speed and stealth, but it's probably not something that will appeal to most people, and both range and accuracy will continue to be a problem, just like with Madden. As we move into stats, expect to hear a lot about Nelson. First, in terms of survivability, 58,500 hit points is pretty much the tier 6 battleship average. Armor is listed at 16 to 419 millimeters, but if you look at the armor model, we have a lot of green here. Your turret faces are your 419, and as you might expect, you have good armor on your conning tower as well as the sides of all of your turrets. What really matters here is the green is all 26. None of this is going to stop 15-inch or larger battleship shells. That's important because your deck is also 26 millimeters. The good news is 26 millimeters will shatter 152 millimeter high explosive shells. That means no damage, except for all those fires they might start, which you may assume is the whole reason that people are doing that in the first place. But it can make a difference. Anything larger that hits the deck, the upper belt, or the superstructure, or the extremities of the ship is going to pen with HE. Every time. Every time. Behind all this relatively minimal protection, the Collingwood has a less well-protected citadel, with your belt being between 305 and 318 millimeters of armor, with the citadel deck being between 95 and 152 millimeters of armor. That means you'll be looking at between 22 and 45 millimeters less protection on the side armor compared to the already somewhat delicate Nelson, while also being more vulnerable to plunging fire. All of this is made somewhat worse by the 32 millimeters being a bit more likely to armor shell than 26 millimeters. Collingwood's torpedo protection is average at 25%, though to be fair to this ship, that is 6% better than Nelson. And just to answer the obvious question, Nelson's armor is easier to work with and, though subjective, probably a bit better. Collingwood comes with 3 turrets, each mounting 2 16.5-inch guns. They are the largest guns on anything at tier 6, in a way that gives you bragging rights that can occasionally lead to a hilarious amount of damage, and will also most likely lead to far more over-penetrations. That said, there's really not a functional advantage to the size of these guns over a standard 16-inch gun, since 406 already overmatched 27 millimeters, and they're not large enough to overmatch 30 or 32 millimeters, and I'm not sure there's a single surface in all of World of Warships that's 29 millimeters, but I can tell you for sure it isn't very common. 26 seconds on the reload is a bit faster than average, and exactly what you'd expect on other 6-gun main battery ships, like Gneisenau. But owing to the smaller number of main battery guns, you end up with the second lowest HE DPM, unlike the Nelson, and you aren't a particularly good fire starter either, at least over time. in spite of this very high 6,150 damage and 47% fire chance. Instead, you'll probably want to shoot AP most of the time and take advantage of the equally large 13,000 AP damage, which is second only to the North Carolina in terms of damage per shell. This also will overmatch almost every bow that you can face among tier 5 and 6 battleships, except for icebreaker bows. Same goes for just about every cruiser except Edinburgh. Your DPM here is again not great, but the key here is that you aren't going to struggle to get through a lot of armor. Downside, like I've said before, is that you're going to overpen a lot of ships. Collingwood also sports a modest secondary battery. These have standard 5-kilometer range, and other than some variation in how they're kind of situated on the ship, they are exactly what you find on Nelson, and neither of these are really ships you want to take into close combat. Nelson is not known for having good AA, and Collingwood unfortunately isn't even as good as Nelson. This 47 is quite poor for a battleship and even below average for cruisers, which unfortunately means that to a carrier, Collingwood will look like a big bag of XP. Long range is only 4.5, but the vast majority of your AA is only 2.5 kilometers or shorter, meaning that you've got very little long-range persuasion and limited time to do any significant damage to planes because they're already successfully attacking you. At 27 knots, the Collingwood is also not very fast. Even for a battleship, it is C-. It would also get pretty average grades for 800-meter turning circle and 14.8 second rudder shift. Not remarkable, but not bad. But though there isn't a lot of variance for detectability of different tier 6 battleships, Collingwood is tied for the best detectability by sea. It is only 100 meters off of being tied for the best from air, but obviously you're not going to be quite as sneaky firing 16.5-inch guns out of smoke. You're close to, but not quite, the most noticeable battleship out there. As we jump into consumables, you do have your standard battleship damage control party. Then we have a repair party, and if you want to think about this mathematically in a comparison between Collingwood and Nelson, would you rather have 3 heals that are 2 times as strong as the average heal, or 2 heals that are 4 times as strong? The duration here does change the math a little, but not enough to actually change the answer that you should probably prefer. And that's before applying any additional heals or improving the strength of your heals through your build. In your second slot, you have the choice between a sonar, 3-kilometer detectability for torpedoes and 4 kilometers versus ships. This is very similar to cruisers at the tier, though a little less powerful than what you'll find on Hood. You could switch this out for the general issue secondary consumable. Both of these are useful at ranges where you probably prefer not to be in Collingwood, but since the ship has kind of a bad secondary battery, it's inconveniently arranged mostly on the back of the ship, and since it's very likely somebody could try to shoot torpedoes at you from further away than that, the sonar is probably more valuable. Last and certainly not least, the Collingwood has a main battery reload booster, probably one of the shiniest of shiny objects and the jingliest of keys in all of World of Warships. This will double your reload speed for 20 seconds. Effectively, this will get you out 1 extra shot in a very short period of time. Very useful for ships with big guns, and you want to catch somebody in the midst of a pro gamer term. And for as much of a gimmick as that is, it is well suited for Collingwood. And now we're going to come to some gameplay. We're going to be on Sleeping Giant, and we'll load into the game here. You can see we've got the Collingwood. It is a very pretty gray on gray on gray on gray on gray. I like this very much. I'm not sure how much it actually breaks up the appearance of the ship, but to each their own. Some people like more colorful things. This looks very good. As MetaJerk would say, this looks very much like the food I like to eat. So, I've put my commander up on the screen. You can see we're going for accuracy and accuracy and accuracy and accuracy, and that's almost as many levels of gray as we have on the ship. We're also going to get a little bit more in terms of our reload from D. Ravel. Other than that, I would prefer not to be seen, and I would prefer to have good range. This is not going to show off the survivability of the Collingwood, because if you were really interested in survivability, I think you'd probably be playing the Nelson instead. In any case, you can see we're kind of hanging out here on the right side of the map. We're getting shot. We're occasionally spotted. We don't have a lot of spots in return, which is unfortunate. It looks like we do have some cruisers moving up a little bit here, and they will be a good deal more stealthy, given that we have two very light cruisers. Second best thing to have here versus having an actual destroyer. We see an Ismail way out there in God's country. We're going to go ahead and see if we can't hit him from 17.7 kilometers away. Follow our shots in there because we're using preset number 2. We don't really come away with much of anything. You see our first over penetration, guaranteed not to be the last. This happens a lot in this particular ship. Next we're shooting at the over Pensacola. We don't even hit him. We emphasize the over on the over Pensacola, managing to land no shots. One of the things about getting a little bit too much accuracy, if you're not properly reading people's mind or otherwise not a particularly good shot, is that you can actually miss all your shots pretty easily if you don't know what you're doing. You can see obviously with that set of attack aircraft inbound, we have an enemy aircraft carrier in the game. I guess that means we have an aircraft carrier too. I feel significantly less good about that than I do how bad I feel about having some aircraft carrier against me. In any case, I would pay a little bit of attention to how effective my AA appears to be against it. Without particularly remembering this game, my guess is that it will be pretty close to not effective at all. Take a couple shots on Alba. We end up with 3 overpens. Looking at our math here pretty quickly, we have, I think, 6 overpens and maybe 1 0 damage for hitting a turret so far. So, you know, we're having a good time in terms of overall shot effectiveness. But at this point, when we actually shoot against that very well angled Alba, we do come away with a decent hit, half damage. Now we have this Soviet ship again out here, just tempting us with that big juicy citadel that it has. We go for the aggressive shot, we get 2 citadels, and all of a sudden it seems like we're actually contributing to the game. And that's one of the nice things about Collingwood. If you actually do manage to land a couple of hits, the damage can add up in a hurry. It's not quite as fast as North Carolina, so it's not exactly as though it's like tier breaking. It's not so high that you'll be like super amazed by the damage this ship can do, but it is nice and it is a pretty good amount. You can see we've already lost our spot. We're going to start turning out because it doesn't look like anybody on this side of the map really wants to contest over here. The New Orleans proves to be too much of a juicy target for me to not shoot at it, so I go ahead and miss it. Such is life. It's not going to be all bad news, though. I kind of do want the enemy team to see that I'm moving away from here. We are going to end up with 2 caps on this side of the big island range. So, like, that's good because puncturing through those series of islands between A, B, and C and D tends to be kind of difficult. So you do end up either having to hope that your team isn't crazy enough to try to sail through them themselves, or is otherwise smart enough to realize that the fight is actually on the margins. And I'm starting to think that our turn here has yielded some benefits, because at this point I'm turning around the long way. And you can see actually that B turret rotates 360, which is nice. It's not going to change your life, but it's nice to at least be able to get one gun on target pretty quickly. And as we come around, I think most of the enemies are going to be in the orbit of C. Some of them may be moving towards D, but it looks like most of them are situated to make the stand at C, and maybe even try to push in towards B. Now we have that Alba again. It is pretty well angled against me. I have lost sight of it. I'm not so much concerned about him in particular. I don't think he has any weapons other than his main battery that can get out to this range. But I am a little bit concerned about other battleships that may have pretty large guns, and I have a pretty poorly protected citadel. And I do want to keep this fight somewhat at range, because if I get too close, then the difference in armor is going to be that much more noticeable. And I don't want to lose those fights. So we are still at range. We're going to go ahead, move towards this island. Most likely I'm not going to sail all the way around it because I won't have the time. We're spotted by Colorado. We start to nose in. We get a couple of decent bounces there. Colorado can't tank our guns to the bow of his ship, and I am more than happy to try to exploit that. I am going to, again, maneuver. This is actually in response to the Alba, because if I'm sailing towards it, I don't want him shooting torpedoes. And his bow would have been more or less pointed in a more favorable direction if I hadn't made this turn. We get 4 pens there. End up with a pretty healthy chunk of damage. Colorado is suffering. Now I will say this might have been a good point for me to have used one of my reload boosters. It didn't end up making much of a difference because, as you can see, we have every bit of ability or caliber to punch through the front of his ship and straight into a citadel. Finishing off the Colorado, we do a little second guessing, third guessing, fourth guessing on New Orleans, and manage to also score a pretty good hit on him. We're up to 97,000 damage, 2 kills, 4 citadels. If you're in the 4 citadel territory, you should be pretty happy with yourself overall for Collingwood, because that by itself almost makes up for the amount of hit points that you have. A couple of overpens on North Carolina. We're happy that North Carolina is behind that island, but it does look like we're being spotted from other sources, which isn't great. There's not a lot of good ways to angle against a North Carolina in this ship, and you can see exactly what a 16-inch gun can do to this particular boat, particularly at long ranges, and especially with American improved AP angles. The Vaser manages to make my life that much more difficult. So I decide to see if I can't snipe him out of the game. The answer is no. 6 overpens is about as luckily unlucky as you can get. Now, I am trying to play the island in front of me in such a way that keeps the North Carolina from being able to see me. I am obviously not paying a lot of attention to him as I try to eliminate the Vesa. He's going to get through my AA pretty easily here, I think. And really my only hope is to try to take him out of the game. We let our third salvo fly. They look pretty good. But it appears as though we have left him on at least a few hit points. So he finishes us off. But that's not going to be for very long. The North Carolina gets taken out, and here we have Phaser as well. We finish off the game with 133,000 damage. Pretty good. So, closing thoughts on the Collingwood. This is one of those ships with a hilariously large caliber for the tier. If you have good aim and can generally make ships like Georgia work at longer ranges, then it's a pretty good chance that you'll find Collingwood satisfying. If your aim is something maybe a bit less than superb, then Collingwood is going to seem like Goliath in a sea of Davids. For those of us with less than stellar marksmanship, and I would include myself in that, who may just otherwise prefer to be a little bit closer in or enjoy the rope-a-dope survivability builds, the Nelson is a really much more attractive option. And other than the notable difference of some light cruisers, quite a bit more survivable. For my money, which admittedly hardly matters in this case since this boat was given to me as a CC, I'd prefer to have a 15-inch version of the F2 or F3 Battlecruiser, including that turret arrangement, something slightly faster without maybe quite so much overpen potential. That's just my thoughts on Collingwood. If you like to play far away, she'll probably work for you. That's not really my game, but let me know what you think in the comments, and of course, I'll see you on the next one.